Hello, my Patreons. I am glad your sacrifices are continuing to flow. I will ensure the tieflings do not necessarily break all your legs the next time you are seen walking down the streets. Of course, we are talking racism in role-playing games, and something that, well, maybe you agree with, maybe you disagree with, maybe you don't think it's relevant. Now, I'm not going to waffle on as I have been doing in the other videos. You probably watch them and you either agree or you disagree. The question then rises in how do we stop ourselves from perpetuating it if we want to, of course, stop ourselves from perpetuating it. And I thought, what better way than to give you some examples of the games that I have run where I have been horribly racist and where I have actively tried to remove the racism from the game once I became aware of it. Now, I'm not going to go into the fact that South Africa is considered one of the remarkable pinnacles of racism on planet Earth and how we as a society have managed to look beyond the colour of our skin whilst creating this fabulous rainbow nation that the world so looks at every time there's a democracy question. Because, in truth, it has worked to a degree and it hasn't worked to another degree and it's got worse to another degree. So it's a very complicated issue. But if I look at some of the examples of things that I have done in the past, my orcs, I'm ashamed to say, have always been orcs. Violent, bloodthirsty, savage-type creatures where instead of looking at how to change them from being exactly as they have been stereotyped racially, I was looking at maybe adding a little cultural quirk here or a little thing there. But I wasn't challenging the status quo of the orc, which means that my orcs were remarkably boring. With goblins, I didn't really do much there either. I changed them very small ways to being a little bit more techno-savvy, but again, that's nothing new. That has been done before, and again, they were perpetuated as this greedy, hoardy little mass of individuals without too much wisdom, but with enough intelligence to be able to do some cool stuff. Gnomes, I kept those exactly the same. They're all inventive little creatures who have sole ambition to blow themselves up. What I did do was I came up with what I called their orders. So they'd have Order 1 through 12, and Order 1 was responsible for agriculture. Order 2 was responsible for heavy weapons. Order 3 was responsible for light weapons. Order 4 was responsible for defense, and so on and so forth. So that each gnome was born and joined an order once they were old enough, but then that's where it stopped. They remained inquisitive, curious, moustached beings who would blow themselves up. Again, I did not challenge the racial stereotyping of gnomes. I'm even worse with my halflings. My halflings, I didn't even bother. There's a reason for it. I'm not particularly fond of halflings. I've never seen much potential in them because, well, they're just a bunch of pipeweed smoking farmers who really just want to have breakfast and lunch and dinner and live a quiet life. Why should that be the case? Now, we've obviously seen Frodo running around trying to buck the system, but in general, the idea has always been that hobbits are a rotund, portly, reclining, reclusive little bunch of farmers, peasants, if you like. That should not necessarily be the case. And yes, there are examples of one or two that have been changed in the course of role-playing history, but they have never really been broken out of that. And tieflings, for example, with their demonic ancestry, must all be these mysterious, crazy creatures who try to manipulate everything that they come across. Well, the tieflings in my world are a little bit more like the mafia than demonic-raised beings of arcane power, but again, not really pushed. I would say the only races that I have actually tried to challenge from a racial stereotyping perspective are my elves, and I've got 3 different types of elves. There are the high elves, which are the exact copy of most high elves, or grey elves as they were originally called, that live in lofty towers and study magic and are all arrogant and haughty and that kind of thing. What I did add to them was a caste system where you had the upper or high-born elves and then you had the low-born elves who were basically indentured slaves And it was an interesting exploration of the society of Victorian England, really, in terms of this massive caste difference. What I did differently there, of course, was that the highborn and the lowborn are decided at birth. So highborn parents might give birth to a little girl who is decided to be lowborn, in which case she's sent off to the slave pits where she will spend the rest of her life while her biological parents continue in their lofty palaces. She may even end up serving them as this useless little whelp. So that was those elves. The other elves that I brought in were the Sajet elves, which are very much based on an idea of the ancient Egyptian ways, with the pharaohs, who was this godlike embodiment, and then a very strong religious culture, and then a very normal working class. So that if you did not necessarily look at their pointed ears, you would just assume that they were effectively Egyptians that had been teleported into Braxia. Of course, the idea that they are very long-lived means that their temples and things took even longer to build and were even more mega in size, because they could. And so that was a certain amount of cultural influence based on the longevity of the elves. But in terms of their skin tone, their olive skin, dark-haired, again, just trying to separate them from the traditional elf. And I realize in doing so, almost continuing the stereotype of what an ancient Egyptian looked like too. But well, one can only go so far. The dwarves, I changed from being these proud warriors to being morose warriors who'd been kicked out by the dark elves, the drow. Now, the drow I've always had a soft spot for, because I particularly like drow. They embodied the alignment which I think a lot of people are, which is lawful evil. They'll do whatever it is that they're required to do by law, but they will also try and get away with whatever they can as well. And I never liked the idea of the drow being this eternally lawful evil bunch of scheming creatures. So I made my drow much more Roman in their approach, which keeps them scheming, certainly, but makes them a lot more interesting, because now they run with a sort of republic-style democracy type of thing, with senates who can influence the way that the Praetor decides on his ultimate decisions, and their society is far more focused around subterranean matters than above ground matters as well. So, and their structures were built out of beautiful marble that was silky white. So bringing in the spider theme, but trying to break the idea of this drow society being dark and evil and that kind of thing. That made them much more interesting, and my players generally prefer running around in the drow or the Sajet areas than in all of the other ones, because it makes it much, much more challenging to play. It's not just cookie-cutter type of stuff. Of course, then I brought in the Graith and the Cathar, or the Cat folk. And the Cathar are based off of an Indian subculture, or culture anyway, during the times of the Great Raj, where there was this massive opulence and this massive indentured majority class who were there just to serve and to run things. And again, the idea was to explore this idea of inequality, of a ruling class. And one of the things that the world is actually exploring is what happens when those start to rebel, what happens when they start to fight back. Because, of course, there's a great equalizer in terms of magic, which in our own environment would have been the firearm, which brought about an equalizer of the haves versus the have-nots. Something that we saw here in South Africa, as a matter of fact. So, as a GM, as a player, you can watch the GM video and you can watch the player video, and I've spoken at length there about how we can change things and challenge the idea of racism and drive things forward. But the question that I pose to you is not just on racism and on whether we should or shouldn't have it in the gaming environment. Well, we do have it in the gaming environment. It's a question of whether we should try and remove it or not, and will it make the games lesser for it? But if the games are lesser for it, what does that say about racism and us and our enjoyment thereof, or therewith, or therewithout? The question that I have for you is, how much of an important role, or lack thereof, do you think role-playing plays in determining society? We are no longer the geeks who are in the back corners. There are now role-playing channels out there who have got thousands, hundreds of thousands, and millions of subscribers. that means there is a very large population of people who will be shaping and changing and molding society through learning and learnt action in games that they've played as youngsters. As board games have now reached unprecedented levels across the market space, they're now becoming far more acceptable, as gaming is becoming more acceptable, as people playing games on their cell phones, which are based off of board games. So then they go and find the board game. Board games, role-playing, it's all linked together, and usually the role players, the ones that are helping develop board games, the ones that all is interlinked in this great space of imagination and the art of collective storytelling, collective playing, collective board gaming, and that kind of thing. Is it something that we need to be cognizant of, and is it something that we need to actively seek to better? Do we just rest on our laurels too much, on the stuff that was established by Tolkien and Gygax way back when? Was Roddenberry right in terms of trying to challenge the status quo of racial tension within the world? And should that be something that we continue to do, or should it be something that we continue to protect? Perhaps as a way of identifying just how silly and backward we were and are as a species to one another, let alone to other species. I don't know. Personally, I feel it is something that we should rebel against, and it's something that we should use as a tool to actively undo and to rip apart and to look at the advantages of looking beyond just the physical and trying to find that which is inside and in the heart of the individual that we're dealing with, rather than just this giant collective that we perceive to being all the same. Anyway, until next time, I wish you the happiest of playing.